So the location we're going to talk about today is actually considered to be one of the most perfect places, if not the most perfect place to commit a murder and get away with it. It was once one of the most isolated places around this particular area, and it was reported that you could basically scream as loud as you could, and you could probably even run for your life, considering how close Interstate 45 was to this location. It didn't really matter because you could scream as loud as you could run as far as you could, and you would probably not get anywhere and you would not be heard. And if you haven't already guessed or figured it out, today we're going to talk about the Texas killing fields located in a rural area of Texas known as League City. But before we get into today's video, I'm just going to introduce myself quickly. If you're new here, my name is Ashley, and on this channel, we like to talk about true crime, the paranormal, and unsolved mysteries. I also have a TikTok channel, which is actually growing quite a lot. I'm very thankful for everyone that has found me over on that channel. I post a lot more content over there around the same topics: true crime, unsolved mysteries, paranormal, supernatural stuff. And I also do some summaries on a few of the longer videos that I have on this channel. So if you guys prefer the TikTok format, make sure to follow me over there. Same username at HeebeeJeebeezTV. I also just want to send everyone a quick thank you for the new subscribers on my channel. We're getting a little bit closer every week to getting monetized. So I am extremely thankful for that, and I'm very excited to see where we can take this channel. So if you guys enjoy my content, please comment, like, subscribe. It really does help me grow. All right, so let's get into today's story. Now, the Texas killing fields are quite infamous. I'm sure many of you have heard about this, and there's actually a Netflix documentary coming out on this in the next couple weeks, or depending when you're watching this, it's probably already on Netflix. But basically, since the 1970s, there have been over 30 bodies that have been discovered within this area known as the Texas killing field. And surprisingly, it is a small piece of land. It's about 25 acres, and it's only 26 miles away from Houston. Sadly, most of the bodies that have been found did belong to either very young girls in their teenage years or young women. But what's even sadder is that most of these cases have gone unsolved. We've been able to determine the identities of most of them, if not all of them, but it's still a mystery as to who did this to these girls, when, where, or even why. There have been a few suspects along the way, but police seem to think that this isn't the work of just one deranged serial killer. They actually have evidence that there's been at least 3 people involved in these serial killings, which leads them to think that there could potentially be a few more people, and that this area known as the killing fields has actually just been a dumping ground for people that have wanted to get away with one of the most heinous crimes a human can commit. What's also made these cases quite difficult to solve is that the Texas killing fields are actually in an area that crosses 3 different police zones. So there's been a lot of confusion with which police station, which county should be responsible for investigating which murders, which has led to a lot of confusion. Evidence has been lost. Investigations could have been conducted a lot cleaner and a lot more efficiently, but unfortunately that just didn't happen. And it's led to a lot of these cases to remain cold. And if that wasn't enough, because a lot of these women were young when they disappeared, like I said, they were in either their late teenage years or their early adult years, police were often very quick to rule them as runaways. So, of course, as you can imagine, this resulted in the investigations not being taken seriously from the beginning, and people just dismissing these girls as people that were running away from their life. And if you're into true crime, you obviously know that the first 24, 48 hours are absolutely critical when it comes to finding a missing person. And if you don't find them within that time zone, the chances of you finding them alive round down to almost nothing. So with that being said, we're going to take a much closer look at the history of the killing fields and the victims. So it all started with a young girl named Colette Wilson, and she was only 13 years old at the time of her disappearance. She was said to have been quite a happy girl. She had a very large family. She was one of 10 children. And on the summer she disappeared, she was actually going to be starting the 8th grade. So the day Colette went missing was June 17th, 1971, and she had just returned from band camp, and she had just been dropped off by the bus at a local intersection where she was supposed to meet her mom. So Colette gets dropped off at this intersection in Alvin, Texas, and her mom's literally on her way, and it's reported that the difference between the time that Colette got dropped off and by the time her mother arrived was mere minutes. When her mom did end up arriving, Colette was nowhere to be seen. Claire, Colette's mother, initially thought that maybe there was some sort of misunderstanding or miscommunication and that her daughter could have possibly gone home with a friend or gotten a ride to their house with one of her friends. So she spent the next couple of hours, doing the tour, going to a few of her daughter's friends' houses to see if Colette was there. But unfortunately, she quickly realized that Colette was not anywhere to be found and no one knew where she was. So with that, Claire was forced to call the police. Infuriatingly, the police told Claire that her daughter was likely a runaway and that there was not much they could do with her, and they declined to investigate the case. Having basically no other choice than to look for her daughter herself, Claire ended up gathering her friends, her family, her entire neighborhood basically, in order to do a land search for her daughter. Unfortunately, they did search high and low, but they didn't end up finding Colette. It would take several months before Colette would be found. So on November 23rd, 1971, a man was out treasure hunting in the Texas killing fields. Specifically, he was in an area called the Attic Reservoir. But instead of finding treasure, he ended up finding a body. And no, it was not Colette. Surprisingly, it was a completely different young woman. She would later be identified as Gloria Gonzalez, who was only 19 at the time of her disappearance. She had actually gone missing from Houston just the month before. So of course, the man alerts the authorities and police get to the site. So as they're investigating the body, they're collecting the evidence, they're collecting pieces of this young woman's body. And there was one particular piece that stood out to them. It was a loose tooth. Initially, they thought it was part of Gloria's anatomy, so they took it with them to evidence. However, when they were later doing testing on this tooth, it was determined that it did not belong to Gloria at all. This essentially prompted the investigators to go back to the killing fields because it basically meant that there must have been at least another body out there. Just 3 days later, on November 26, 1971, approximately 5 months after Colette went missing, her body was found in the killing fields, very close to where Gloria's body was also found. Sadly, her father had to be the one to identify her because he happened to be a dentist and he was also Colette's dentist, so he was able to identify her using her teeth records, but also by a specific ring that was a peace ring that Colette always wore on one of her fingers. Her cause of death ended up being ruled due to a skull fracture caused by blunt force trauma, which was later determined to be from a gunshot wound. And it was actually said that so little of Colette's body was remaining and was actually found in the fields that her family was forced to bury her in a casket made for infants. As for Gloria, her death was also determined to be the same as Colette, blunt force trauma to the skull due to a gunshot wound. And just in 1971 alone, 4 more victims would be found in the Texas killing fields. And little did police know that this would basically be the beginning of a 50-year-old mystery. So on July 1st, that same summer of 1971, 14-year-old Brenda Jones was actually walking on her way to the Galveston Hospital in order to visit her aunt. Unfortunately, she never made it to the hospital and was reported missing that very same day. The very next day, her body was discovered floating in the Galveston Bay, and her cause of death was also determined to be from blunt force trauma to the head. Then there's Allison Craven, who was just 12 years old when she went missing that same year on November 9th. Her mother had actually left Allison home alone in their apartment, which was located near Interstate 45, which is very close to the killing fields. Her mother had actually gone out for about an hour to run some errands. She figured that her daughter would be completely safe being home alone, And also keep in mind that during the 70s, the 80s, even the early 90s, parents were a lot more inclined to trust their children, to let them be a little bit more independent. However, when Allison's mother returned home, Allison was not at home and she was nowhere to be found. So of course, she reported her missing to the police. Of course, a search began, and initially there were a few pieces of Allison that were discovered in a nearby field, but it wasn't until February 25th, 1972 that the rest of Allison's skeleton was discovered just 5 miles away from her home. Just a couple days after Allison disappeared, Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson vanished on November 11th, 1971. Both girls were 15 years old at the time, and they were friends. And on that particular day, they had actually decided to go shopping at their local mall. Sadly, that would be the last time they were ever seen alive. 2 days later, their bodies were both discovered floating by a fisherman in Turner's Bayou. They were found to be bound both by their feet and their hands. They were also partially clothed, and it was determined that their cause of death was due to gunshot wounds. During the rest of 1971, of course, people started getting nervous. Word started spreading that there was a potential serial killer on the loose. And there would be a lot more young women reported as missing the rest of that year. Unfortunately, more bodies wouldn't be discovered until 1972. On January 3rd, 1972, police discovered the 2 bodies of 2 girls that had been reported missing. They were the bodies of 14-year-old Rhonda Johnson and 13-year-old Sharon Saw. And both girls were last seen walking near the Seawall Boulevard in August of 1971. Their remains ended up being discovered in a marsh. Then from here, no more bodies were found until 1973, but the reports of missing women just kept coming in. The next victim was 16-year-old Kimberly Pitchford, who disappeared on January 3rd. And she was last seen at a driving school in Pasadena near Interstate 45, where she was supposed to take her driver's test. Her parents knew she was there, and they were actually expecting her to give them a call when she was finished so they can go pick her up. So her parents waited and waited, but the call never came, and eventually they did report their daughter missing. Her body would then be found just 2 days later in a ditch. The following year, on September 6, 1974, 2 teenage girls were reported missing from a convenience store in Dickinson, Texas. These 2 girls would turn out to be Georgia Gear, who was 14 at the time, and her friend Brooks Gracewell, who was just 12 years old. Both girls were friends, and unfortunately on that particular day, they decided to rebel and ended up skipping school and instead ended up spending the day together. Unfortunately, that would be the last time both of the girls were seen alive at this convenience store, and their bodies weren't discovered until April 3rd of 1981, where they were found next to each other in a ditch near Alvin Swamp. Then there's the story of Susan Bowers, who was just 12 years old when she disappeared after taking a walk around her neighborhood. She disappeared on May 21st, 1977, but sadly her remains wouldn't be discovered until March 25th, 1979. Then the 80s came around, and they weren't any different from the 70s. The amount of missing women reports just kept coming in, and more bodies were also found in the Texas killing fields. The next one involves the only male that was found in the killing fields, and that was Dean Klaus, who was 20 years old at the time, along with his wife Tina Klaus, who was just 17. And in October of 1980, the couple was actually reported missing all the way from Florida, along with their young baby daughter. Their bodies were discovered in the killing fields in January of 1981, but their identities weren't actually revealed to the public until this past year in 2022. And on top of that, while police never discovered the daughter's remains in the killing fields and they didn't know about her whereabouts, it was recently discovered that she was alive and living in Oklahoma. Michelle Garvey was only 15 and she disappeared on June 1st, 1982 and was found on July 1st, 1982. Heidi Villalfai, 20, disappeared on October 10th and her body was discovered on April 4th, 1984. Laura Miller, she disappeared when she was just 16 on September 10th and her body wasn't found until February 3rd, 1986. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about Laura because her case does play a more significant role in the theories of potential suspects later on. Shelley Sykes was just 19 when she disappeared on May 24th, 1986. Her body was never found, but we'll also revisit her story later on in the video. Suzanne Richardson was 22 when she disappeared on October 7th, 1988, and sadly, her body was never found, but it is expected or suspected of being in the killing field somewhere. The disappearances didn't stop in the 80s. Surprisingly, they went on all throughout the 90s, and even more surprisingly, they went on into the early and mid-2000s. So here we're going to go into the names of those victims. Donna Prudhomme was just 34 when she disappeared in 1991, and her body was found that same year on September 8th, and she was only recently identified in the past couple years. Trellis Sykes was 16 when she disappeared on May 13th, 1994, and her body was found on the very same day. Lynette Bibbs was 14 when she disappeared on February 1st, 1996, and her body was found on February 3rd of the same year. Tamara Fisher, who was friends with Lynette, disappeared on the same day, and her remains were found with her friend on February 3rd. Crystal Baker was 13 when she disappeared on March 5th, 1996, and her body was also found on the same day. Laura Smither, 12, disappeared on April 3rd, 1997, and her body was discovered on April 20th, 1997. Kellyanne Cox disappeared when she was 20 on July 15th, 1997, and her body was found that same summer. Jessica Kane was 17 when she disappeared on August 17, 1997, and her body was found on March 18, 2016, a very long time for her body to be discovered. Tot Harriman was 57 when she disappeared on July 12, 2001, and her body has not been found, but it is suspected to be somewhere in the killing fields. Sarah Trusty was 23 when she disappeared on July 12, 2002, and her body was found on July 27, 2002. Teresa Venegas was 16 when she disappeared on October 31, 2006, and her body was found just a few days later on November 3, 2006. Since then, the killing fields have gone very quiet. It's suspected that the amount of development going on in the area has taken away from the attraction of how isolated and rural it once was, making it a less than ideal place for a killer to murder someone or let alone dump a body without being seen by someone. So when it comes to the identities, there may very well still be more victims out there that police simply have not found and have not identified. But those are all the names that I just mentioned. Those are all the names that I was able to come across through various publications of the news. Initially, when these bodies were discovered, many of the women were unidentified. They were as Jane Does, but thanks to progressive technology and DNA testing, a lot of their identities came to be known. And fortunately, that was also the way that they discovered a few of these suspects. But like I said at the beginning of my video, authorities have always suspected that the work of the killing fields has been a result of multiple serial killers and not just one individual in particular. And that's what we're going to go into in this next portion of the video. Who is responsible for at least some of these murders? Suspect number 1 goes by the name of Edward Bell. He was actually one of the more prominent suspects of the killing fields, but shockingly, he was actually never charged with any of these murders, even though he confessed to it. So a little bit of back history on Edward. He was born and raised in Texas, but unfortunately, he did not have a very easy life. And this is in no way any form of justification of what he did, but he did have a very rough childhood where his father was said to have been extremely abusive to him, manipulative, very narcissistic towards him, and he was even said to have encouraged his son to commit crimes. Edward did grow up to have a relatively normal life up until 1996, and that's when things went completely downhill and spiraled out of control. In 1966, he was arrested for exposing himself to a bunch of young girls, but instead of being arrested and put in prison, he was actually sent to a mental hospital where he ended up staying for a short amount of time and then was eventually released. As you can imagine, this just ended up in him doing the same thing again in 1969, where he did end up exposing himself once again to more young women, and he was sent again to the mental hospital. Eventually, he was released, and he did go on to remarry someone else after his first wife divorced him. And shockingly, his second wife ended up being a 17-year-old girl, and together they ended up moving to Galveston, Texas. This disgusting behavior of Edwards and his continuous habit of exposing himself to young women continued well into the 60s and 70s. And every time he would get caught, the charges would either get dropped, dismissed. For whatever reason, they were never actually pursued in court. That is until August 24th of 1978, when finally someone stood up to him. He was said to have been driving down the road on that particular day when he spotted a group of young girls. He then decided to pull over and literally expose himself and start pleasing himself in front of these girls. Obviously, all of these women were completely horrified. They started screaming, crying, not knowing what to do. And all of this attention ended up attracting the attention of another bystander nearby. This ended up being a man named Larry Dean, and conveniently, he happened to be a Marine. So being that type of man, he wasn't just going to let Edward do this and get away with it. He starts approaching Edward in order to stop him from doing what he was doing. But Edward ended up seeing him and ended up being ahead of him by a couple steps. So Edward pulls out his pistol and shoots Larry point blank. This would sadly end up killing Larry, and then Edward would end up going on the run for the next 14 years, living throughout Mexico and Central America. It wasn't until 1993 that Edward would be arrested after he was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and it was discovered that he had been living in Panama City at the time. He was then extradited back to America, where he was put on trial for the murder of Larry. And thankfully, he was found guilty and sentenced to 70 years in prison. It was there in prison that he would then finally confess that something authorities were not expecting him to confess to. In 1998, Edward ended up writing several handwritten notes that were sent to the prosecutors in Galveston and Harris counties, where he ended up claiming responsibility for the deaths of 11 girls between the years 1971 and 1977. He even had a name for these group of girls. He ended up calling them the 11 from Heaven. In those letters, he ended up claiming responsibility for the deaths of the following victims: Colette Wilson, Debbie Ackerman, Maria Johnson, and Kimberly Pitchford, all who were found to be in the Texas killing fields. As for the 7 remaining girls, he simply said that he could not remember their names, but he knew that he had killed 11 women. Of course, police approached this confession with a lot of skepticism because they were unsure if Edward was actually telling the truth. Was he trying to get a deal on his sentence? Was he trying to avoid the death sentence? Was he just doing for attention? Was he trying to create chaos? There are many reasons this confession could have been fake. So police were quite skeptical to believe him. However, many people from the public seem to believe that he was telling the truth because he was living in Galveston during the time of the killing fields. So it would have been the right time period. And he also had an extensive criminal record. So it wasn't completely far-fetched for him to have committed something like this. And frustratingly, there was just not enough solid evidence to prove that Edward committed these murders. It doesn't matter if he confessed to it. Police still have to prove in court beyond a reasonable doubt that he was responsible for these crimes with evidence. And unfortunately, they just didn't have that. Edward would spend the rest of his life in prison for the death of Larry, and he would die in 2019 at the age of 82. So if he did commit these crimes, I guess you could say there was some justice, although it wasn't actually proven as factual. It's a hard pill to swallow that he could have been, at least found publicly guilty of these crimes, but we'll never actually know the full truth at this point. The second suspect is a man named William Lewis Reese. In the mid-1990s, William had actually just been released from prison for committing some heinous crimes against women, both violently and all of the other kinds. So So upon his release, his plans were to relocate from Oklahoma to Texas, and that's exactly what he did. It was May 1997 when 19-year-old Sandra Sapal pulled up to a gas station and was going to refuel her car. So she leaves her car and goes inside to pay. And when she comes back, she sees that the tires on her car have been slashed. So she's quite confused at this point and is not fully paying attention to her surroundings. And that's when William Reese approaches her with a knife and forces her to get into his truck. Sandra was also pregnant at the time, and she also had 2 other children. So she definitely had a reason to live and survive, which is probably what helped her do the following. So as Williams is speeding down Interstate 45, Sandra is trying to figure out how to get out of this, and she does the only thing she could think of. As he's literally speeding down the highway, she opens the passenger door and throws herself out the passenger side onto the road, onto incoming traffic. Thankfully, the woman behind the truck ended up seeing this, and she slams on her brakes and rushes over to Sandra to see if she's okay, helps her. They get into her car, and she ends up driving her to the hospital, where Sandra would go a lot of extensive treatments in order to heal from her injuries. Throughout her healing, and once she was able to communicate a lot more clearly, she underwent hypnosis in order to see if she could recall any other details of what happened on that night. And during one of these hypnotic sessions, she was actually able to remember the license plate of the truck, which ended up leading to the arrest of Williams. He would end up being charged and convicted of kidnapping, which resulted in him being sentenced to 60 years in prison. However, it would then take the police 18 entire years to fully connect him to his past. Using DNA testing, police were able to connect him and identify him as the killer of another young woman named Tiffany Johnson. And although she was not related to the Texas killing fields, this discovery ended up leading to Williams being placed on death row. So this basically forced Williams to think about what he wanted to do, see if he could negotiate the death row sentence. So he figured that he would just confess to other crimes he had committed in hopes that he would be removed from death row. He revealed that in 1997, he had actually been stalking the Texas killing fields area in hopes of targeting vulnerable women. He would then admit to killing Laura Smither, Kelly Ann Cox, and Jessica Kane, all who were discovered in the killing fields. He was then able to give the exact locations of where he had buried each of these women, and police were able to discover 2 of the 3 bodies. Fortunately, he was denied being removed from death row or any sort of deal, and he still remains in prison to this day. And he was found guilty of those 3 murders he confessed to just this past June 2022. The third suspect is a man named Kevin Edison Smith. Kevin Smith had actually been arrested for minor drug charges in Louisiana in 2010. And at that time, his DNA was taken as a sample and it was tested on a few cases police were looking at. His DNA ended up being an exact match to the DNA found on the body of Crystal Jean Baker, whose body was found in the fields in 1996. He would then admit that he did kill her, that he had given her a ride, and instead of taking her where he had promised her, he ended up choking her with a leather strap. And in court, it only took the jury 30 minutes to find him guilty and sentence him to life in prison. Suspect number 4 is named Clyde Hendrick. Now, before we go into this particular suspect, I just want to make it clear that this person has not been formally charged or convicted with any crimes, but he does have a lengthy criminal record and he is considered to be the main suspect in the murder of Laura Miller. So Laura vanished in 1984 and was discovered in the Texas killing fields in 1986. And ever since then, her father has made it his life mission to find out who did this to his daughter. Although a lot of the information he claims to have, a lot of the evidence remains sealed, but he claims to have enough information and enough proof to say that Clyde is responsible for the murder of his daughter. However, the only reason they are not releasing that information at the time is because investigators don't want to compromise the case in any way, shape, or form, which is completely understandable. And just to show you how sure her father is that this is the guy responsible, he actually ended up filing a wrongful death suit against Clyde and ended up winning. he was granted $24 million in liability and damages in 2004. This would prevent Clyde from ever profiting off of the murder of his daughter in case he were ever to confess to it. So basically, this would mean that he would not be able to make any money off of any book deals, movie deals, TV deals, interviews, whatever, any shape or form. Any money that he would make off of that would go straight to Laura's father. Clyde is also considered to be a very dangerous person with a lengthy criminal record. In 2014, he was charged and found guilty of involuntary manslaughter of another woman named Ellen Ross Simpson Beeson, whose body was discovered in 1984. However, just last year, and this is very surprising to me, he was released after serving only 8 of the 20 years he had been sentenced to for good behavior. He's currently on parole until 2033. However, that's not it. He's also suspected of being involved in another murder of the Killing Fields, and this comes from a former inmate of his who claims that Clyde confessed to him that he was involved in the murder of Heidi Fye, but we still cannot fully confirm that that is the case. Then the final suspect on this list is a man named Mark Stallings. In 2013, Mark Stallings ended up confessing to dumping the body of a woman in 1991. This woman would later be identified as Donna Prudhomme, whose body was indeed discovered in 91. In his confession, he ended up giving a lot of information that only the killer would know. And for example, he went into a lot of detail as to why he ended up picking Donna as his victim. And he basically said that she looked extremely vulnerable. He described her as being trashed and wasted. She was quite thin. So he figured that she was in a vulnerable position. So when he spotted Donna along the side of the road, he asked her if she wanted to ride somewhere and she accepted. But sadly, he ended up telling police that he knew that he was going to kill her from the moment he saw her. So she gets into the car with him, fully trusting him. But instead of taking her to her destination, he takes the seatbelt buckle, slams it on her head, which ends up kind of disorienting her, and then he strangles her to death with the seatbelt. Unfortunately, like the first suspect, Edward Bell, they simply do not have enough solid evidence to prove that Mark is responsible for the murder of Donna, even though he has confessed to it. So sadly, they have not charged him with that murder, but he is in jail for unrelated charges. And when it comes to the rest of the women, there have been no further updates on who could have possibly done this to them. There are still a lot of women whose cases are completely cold, and even a couple that remain unidentified, sadly. But, you know, technology is constantly growing. It's constantly changing. So we can only hope that that will help us find more clues and lead us to the potential suspects and hopefully convictions. But that's where today's story ends. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Who do you think is responsible for more of these killings? Have you guys heard of any other reliable suspects? If so, drop a comment. I would love to hear your theories or your opinions. Or if you live in the area near the killing fields, let me know if you guys have heard of any other stories or information that is not necessarily been spread across the internet yet. All right, that's it for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. And don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and to visit me over on TikTok, same username, HeebeeJeebeezTV. And I will see you in the next episode.